Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is What's Left, the show that used to be called Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host, and for nearly a half an hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I think are worthy of your attention, so pay attention. If you have any reactions, anything you want to say, you can email me directly. This is my personal email here, whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be here a couple of times during the show. So you can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there. If you do send email, as always, two things. Please include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer. So with that, let's get on with it. We're going to start off the week with some good news in the form of an update. Although the truth is, rather than calling this good news, I should temper that some and call it encouraging news. I mentioned last show about a move by students at colleges and universities around the country to pressure their respective school administrations to make their schools a sanctuary campus. That is, a school that will limit its cooperation with federal immigration authorities. The news here is that those students are gaining some significant support from within the education field. For one thing, on November 22nd, the American Association of University Professors expressed its support for the movement for sanctuary campuses. For another, as of November 29th, which is the last time I checked, just under 400 college and university presidents from public and private institutions around the country had signed a statement in support of continuing the policy of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, or DACA. That policy allows certain undocumented immigrants who came here as minors to receive a renewable 2-year deferment of any deportation action. Now, unfortunately, DACA establishes neither lawful residency for such a person, nor does it provide them with a path to citizenship. But at least it does provide some protection against deportation as long as the policy remains in force. Now, a 2011 memo from the Department of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with the appropriate acronym ICE, that memo appears to establish that, as a general rule, ICE agents cannot step onto a campus or another sensitive location to investigate or initiate deportation proceedings unless there is either prior consent by the facility or express permission from one of 4 high officials in the agency. The effect of this is that while colleges and universities can't actually prevent ICE agents from going on campus to grab somebody for deportation, the schools can hinder that effort by refusing to cooperate in any way not required by law or court order. Now, how effective that act of hindering will obviously depend on the circumstances, but a school could go a long way towards helping to secure some security for its students. One other quick point on this is that there were some schools that were not targeted for protest to call themselves sanctuary campuses, because those schools, to some degree or another, already had. Now, I have 2 other updates, neither of which carry any hopeful or encouraging news with them. One is that 2 organizations which track hate crimes, this is the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Council on American Islamic Relations, both of them say there has been a spike in the cases of hate crimes, harassment, or intimidation in the wake of the November election. A spike that is actually even worse than the one that occurred in the immediate wake of 9/11. Last show, I reported that the SPLC had recorded more than 200 hate crimes in just the 5 days since the election. The update here is that by 10 days after the election, that number had risen to 867, and that's not counting online instances. Finally, on our updates, a couple of weeks ago I ran down some good outcomes from the election, mostly involving initiatives at a state level instituted by various liberal activist groups. I had examples of victories on minimum wage, gun control, and campaign finance, among some others. There was, however, one big winner in such initiatives on election night: death, or more accurately, the death penalty. A total of 4 ballot initiatives in 3 states were on the ballot, and there were 2 in California, 1 in Nebraska, and 1 in Oklahoma. In all 4 cases, death won. The California case involved one initiative, Prop 62, which would have outright banned the death penalty. That lost by 54 to 46. It was actually the second time in 4 years that Californians had failed to overturn the death penalty. Meanwhile, Prop 66, according to its proponents, would hasten official murders by limiting the time and opportunity for appeals. Now, in fact, it likely won't do that because the proposition is poorly and confusingly written and actually raises questions about illegal interference with the jurisdiction of California state courts. And so it's already facing legal challenges that could take years to work through. But even so, the fact is it squeaked through 51 to 49. In Nebraska, the state legislature had passed a ban on capital punishment, passing it over the veto of Death Eater Governor Pete Ricketts. Now, Ricketts, who also, by the way, is the CEO of Ameritrade, dumped $200,000 of his own money into what proved to be a successful initiative campaign to overturn the legislative action. Finally, Oklahoma, the state that has become the poster child for the failures of the system, pockmarked with convictions based on little or no evidence, botched executions, and shocking incompetence and deceit among officials. That state easily passed a state constitutional referendum that declares that no matter the means of execution, capital punishment is not cruel or unusual punishment. The silver lining in all this is that it comes against a background of a slow but steady decline in the use of the death penalty in the United States. California, for example, has not had an execution in 11 years. The number of executions per year keeps dropping, and as does the number of new death penalty sentences imposed. And according to both Gallup and Pew Research, while public support for the death penalty remains high at about like 55 to 60%, that figure is actually also a 40-year low. Unhappily, the death penalty remains, and unhappily, it remains popular, but happily, it is slowly being put to the death it itself deserves. All right, from there, we move on to one of our regular features. This is the outrage of the week. This is something I've been meaning to talk about for week after week and have failed to do so. But it's become such a huge moral and ethical outrage that silence is simply no longer an option. I am talking about the brutal violence and repression being visited on the peaceful protesters at Standing Rock. The issue, as I expect you know, revolves around a $3.8 billion pipeline, a project to build a pipeline called the Dakota Access Pipeline, or DAPL, across 4 states, from North Dakota to Illinois, at which point the crude oil would be transported to refineries via railroad or an existing pipeline, after which it would likely be sold overseas. The pipeline route crosses Sioux land that was granted to the tribe by the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1857, but later was taken away without the agreement of the tribe or their agreement to cede any land. In April of this year, concerned over the prospect of the project for damage to sacred sites and the safety of the water, members of the Standing Rock Lakota Nation and some allies established a spirit camp at Sacred Rock near Lake Oahe, where the pipeline is to tunnel under the Missouri River, which is the tribe's main source of drinking water. There has been an encampment at the site ever since, protesting the pipeline and calling for it to be halted, or at the very least rerouted. And interestingly, a route north of Bismarck had originally been proposed, but it was rejected because of its proximity to water supply areas, a consideration that was not extended to the Standing Rock Lakota. In the months since, the natives and their allies, both native and non-native who have joined them, who jointly call themselves water protectors, have been subjected to increasing levels of mistreatment and violence by officials, even as they themselves remained largely non-violent. It's been bad enough that at least 2 cops have quit rather than continue to take part in it, and some police forces have refused to provide additional personnel to back up the North Dakota cops. Between August and the end of November, police made nearly 575 arrests, including at least 7 journalists, which created, officials now whine, an unprecedented burden on the state's court system. And you might remember what I said a couple of shows ago about the necessity of filling the jails. Things came to a head in a way on November 20th. That evening, protesters tried to move a burned-out truck that officials had placed across the roadway to keep protesters from approaching the work area down the road. The police responded with rubber bullets, beanbag rounds, pepper spray, explosive tear gas grenades, and water cannons, despite the fact that the temperature was well below freezing. Over 300 people were injured, 26 of them taken to hospital. Hilariously, Morton County Sheriff Kyle Kirschmeyer claimed, "We don't have water cannons, and this is just a fire hose," as if that was supposed to make a real difference, and that it was sprayed more as a mist, and we didn't got it directly on them. We just wanted to make sure to use it as a measure to keep everybody safe. So you see, it was for the protesters' own good and for their safety that they were soaked in water in sub-freezing temperatures. But the protesters, the water protectors, still would not go away. The encampment would not disappear, so officials have upped the ante. On November 25th, the Army Corps of Engineers demanded that thousands of people clear out of a second camp, known as Oseti-Sakowin, or the 7 Council Fires, which is located on land that the Corps controls. 3 days later, North Dakota Governor Jack Dalrymple declared that camp must be evacuated immediately, which was followed by the declaration of the Morton County Sheriff's Department that it will begin to block supplies from reaching the camp. Now, they backed off that later, saying that, we won't block supplies. It's just that if anybody brings supplies in, we're going to fine them $1,000 each. So officials couldn't wait out the encampment. They couldn't drive it out. They couldn't order it out. Now they're going to try to starve it out. And look, they learned something. The Corps of Engineers said the eviction was, quote, to prevent death, illness, or serious injury to inhabitants of encampments due to the harsh North Dakota winter conditions. Governor Dalrymple said the camp's semi-permanent shelters were not suitable for winter habitation under the state's building codes. So you see, it's all about public health and safety, about an adequate shelter, about building codes, not about police or politics or serving the interests of our corporate masters, not at all. Those of us with moderately long memories will recall that this is exactly the sort of claim that was used to crush the Occupy encampments, that they had to be demolished for the health and safety of the people in the encampments. Now, it remains to be seen how successful this reprise will be. On December 4th, a date that likely will have passed by the time you see this, as many as 2,000 veterans will gather at Standing Rock for a 3-day muster to act as human shields between the cops and the protesters. One veteran who's intending to take part, L'Oreal Blackshaw, said, "Okay, are you going to treat us veterans who have served our country in the same way as you have those water protectors?" That too remains to be seen. What is long since obvious is that this pipeline should be stopped and the permit to drill under Lake Oahe in the Missouri River should be denied, and what has been going on at Standing Rock is an outrage. And we're taking a break. And we're back. All right, something I have to deal with at least one more time. I said last time that there have been 4 major excuses offered as to why Hillary Clinton lost the battle for the presidency to an unarmed opponent. I also said that this time I would go into why those excuses are either bogus or deeply flawed, and I'm going to do that now. I'm going to try to do it briefly because I want to get past the election itself to what the response should be and about the responses to the election. All right, the first was blame third parties. This is based on, and I use the word very advisedly, analysis done at CNN that listed 4 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida, and where they said that if Clinton got all of Jill Stein's votes and half of Gary Johnson's votes, she would have won the state. This argument was echoed by liberal darling Rachel Maddow, who said on election night that if you vote for someone who isn't going to win, it means you don't care who's president. Now, besides being exercised in pure fantasy, this argument is actually undermined by fact. The BBC reported that according to exit polls, only about a quarter of Johnson and Stein voters would have backed Clinton if they had to pick between her and the rump. Another 15% would have backed him, and most, as much as 60% of the total, said they just wouldn't have voted for president if the choices were limited to those 2 people. The second argument was blame sexism, and there is a lot of that. For example, big-time blogger and writer for Salon.com, Amanda Marcotte, said that the election proved that, quoting, America would self-destruct rather than elect a female president. Which is actually a rather bizarre, not to say untenable argument, when you remember that Clinton won the popular vote by a margin which, as of now, is something around 2.5 million votes. Third argument was blame Russia. This is based on the claim that the leak of the DNC emails was supposedly done by a Russian agency. But it was an argument made, no surprise here, without reference to the fact that it was what was in the emails that was damaging, not the fact that they were leaked. And there's also an ominous undertone to this argument, which refers to the email coming out in dribs and drabs. But it wasn't Russia or Russian agency that released them to the media. It was WikiLeaks. And so the argument actually implicates WikiLeaks as being part of a Russian plot to manipulate U.S. elections. Some, in fact, made the argument explicit. An article in the Washington Post described WikiLeaks as having, and I'm quoting, benefited financially from a Russian state propaganda arm, used Russian operatives for security, and made clear an intent to harm the candidacy of Hillary Clinton, unquote, and described the email releases as not legitimate news, but an intelligence operation by a hostile foreign power. What makes all this bitterly amusing is that there is evidence that John Podesta was not hacked. Rather, he fell for a phishing scheme and wound up giving away his password. He wasn't hacked, he screwed up. All right, the fourth argument I cited was blame James Comey. Now, there is some truth to that. There is no question that reopening the wound about Clinton's private email server hurt the Clinton campaign. But again, it's argument made without reference to the fact that the original wound, the email server itself and the crappy way it was dealt with and the issues surrounding it was dealt with, that original wound was self-inflicted. All of these excuses, all of these 4 things have one thing in common, which is, I noted last time, they don't require you to look at your own failures. They don't require you to change anything. They are all about the political establishment maintaining its power and control. Since the last show, in fact, another claim has emerged. You shouldn't be surprised that this one, too, shifts the blame from the Democratic Party machine and the Clinton campaign and onto someone else. It is a bit surprising, though. It's blame Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, who endorsed Clinton, who campaigned for her, even to the point of angering some of his own supporters, is now being blamed for her losing. An article in Time actually dubbed Sanders, quoting, the Ralph Nader of 2016, the leftist most responsible for helping the Republicans win, unquote. Now, leave aside the fact that Ralph Nader did not cost Al Gore the 2000 election, and the claim that he did was nothing more than a dress rehearsal for the kind of blame-shifting, responsibility-dodging nonsense that we're seeing now. And frankly, if anybody wants to argue that point with me, you are welcome to do so. You will lose. The author's argument here, though, is that by having run in the primaries, Sanders, quote, pushed Clinton too far left to prevent an effective recentering in the fall, and calls Sanders' criticism of Clinton a vampire effect that enfeebled her. Now, Two quick sidebars. One is that the author cites as a centrally damaging feature of Sanders' campaign is that it, quoting, treated Hillary Clinton as a compromised Wall Street worshipping establishment sellout, to which my response is, and? The other sidebar, filed under the heading of Sometimes You Gotta Just Laugh, is that the fact that the piece in Time is illustrated with an image of Clinton and Sanders campaigning for her side by side in North Carolina the week before the election. They must have airbrushed out the vampire wounds, the bite marks on her neck. Getting back to the point, though, the argument being made, in short, is that it was inherently wrong, inherently invalid, inherently destructive, inherently inappropriate for anybody to challenge Hillary Clinton from the left. Now, not, I emphasize, simply to challenge her. The author mentions John Kerry and Joe Biden as having deferred to Clinton, but gives no hint that they would have enfeebled her had they run. No, but rather that it is inherently unacceptable to challenge her or to challenge the Democratic Party from the left. And it's not just some aggrieved Clintonite going with this. During an appearance on CBS this morning on November 14th, Sanders was asked if he feels any responsibility for Clinton losing because, after all, he did criticize her, you know. The implication, again, was, how dare you challenge the candidate of the establishment, and it's your fault if anything goes wrong. This is not about analysis. This is about a political and social establishment maintaining and keeping power and being unwilling to brook any challenge to that power, even if it comes from within that same establishment. Now, you want some evidence of that? Well, here's one: Bernie Sanders. As I pointed out way back in February, Sanders is a sitting U.S. Senator, a former member of the House. He has like a 33-year career in government service, 25 of those at the federal level. He is part of the establishment. You want another one? Another example? Here's one more recent one. The White House has indicated that it is opposed to Representative Keith Ellison becoming chair of the DNC because he is the wrong messenger. They suggested instead outgoing Labor Secretary Tom Perez and former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm. Okay, here's the difference. Ellison endorsed Sanders during the primary campaign. The other two acted as Clinton's surrogates during the general election campaign. It's about maintaining power. By the way, I should say I include mainstream media comfortably and profitably settled into the twin roles of stenographers and gatekeepers to power in that same overall political establishment. Thing is, look, in considering the outcome of the election and the question of what we of the left, the real left, are up against and what we should look to do, something we have to realize is that the sort of fears and frustrations that Sanders articulated and that the rump fed on like a parasite, in fact, those fears and frustrations are real, just like the bigotries the rump fed on are also real. Those fears and frustrations are based on a real sense and a real fact of economic and social insecurity, and underneath that of economic inequality. I'm reminded of the furor in 2008 over Obama saying that voters in rural Pennsylvania cling to guns or religion. He got a lot of heat for that, but his point, not as well explained as it might have been, was actually valid. When people feel that things that they have relied on, have counted on, things like stable jobs and stable communities, and the conviction that their children have a better life than they've had, when they feel those things are dissolving before their eyes, turning to dry sand slipping through their fingers, they will hold more tightly, they will cling to those things that they still feel they do have, and those things they can control. This is an entirely natural, normal human response to stress. But here's the kicker here, and to get to that, I have to make a quick detour. Another claim recently circulating is that the rump's election was blamed on white people, that it was white people who elected him. Well, it is true that a majority of whites, including a majority of white women, voted for the rump, but they were not the only ones. According to exit polls cited by the New York Times, 29% of Latinos, 29% of Asians, and 8% of blacks also voted for the rump. Yes, Clinton won all those constituencies handily, but here's the point. Clinton did just about as well among whites as Obama did in 2012. But she did 7 percentage points worse with blacks. 8 points worse with Latinos, 11 points worse with Asians, and 5 points worse among young voters. A different comparison of exit polls had those same differences, a point or two smaller, but essentially the same. Those differences and the potential impact they had on the outcome cannot be ignored. So here's the kicker, the bottom line of what the Clinton campaign and the whole damn self-serving literal political establishment got wrong. All that talk about fears and frustrations, all that talk about economic stress, about the loss of the things you counted on, about the loss of the hope your children will have a better life, all of that doesn't just apply to white people. It wasn't that the Democrats ignored the economic concerns of white people, it's that they ignored the economic concerns of non-white people. Yes, blacks are concerned about racism and police violence, but it's not all they're concerned about. Yes, women are concerned about sexism and sexual violence, but it's not all they're concerned about. Yes, LGBTQ people are concerned about discrimination and the rate of suicide, but it's not all they're concerned about. Yes, Muslims in the country are concerned about xenophobia and Islamophobia, but it's not all they're concerned about. People are also concerned about providing a life for themselves, a secure home for their families, a future for their children, and that is what the liberal political establishment failed to recognize. Why? Because they thought they could take all of us for granted. All of those of us on the left who know the changes we need lie and more than half measures. And they thought all of those they thought they could buy off with pretty words and paltry promises about a justice that is coming in spite of them, not because of them. They thought they could take all of us for granted. And because they would rather look to maintain their power and control through appeals to social justice, which would not affect them, rather than to economic justice, which would. All right, and let me wrap up right here. Let me wrap up right here by making something clear. I am not saying, as I would surely be accused, of dissing or sneering at what is called identity politics and urging it be dropped in favor of so-called lunch pail politics. I'm not, because I don't see the need to make that choice. In fact, I see the need not to make that choice. I've said I don't know how many times that if I could sum up my goals in a single word, that word would be justice. But justice has to be in its truest sense, economic, social, and political, because without all three, it's not really justice. That's what we have to recognize. It's what the political establishment refuses to recognize because it would affect their position. These people are not on your side. All right, I'm starting to ramble here, so I'm going to cut myself off because I'm also running out of time. I'm going to try to leave aside election analysis from now on, at least until there's a new election. But I want to keep coming back to some of the, for lack of a better term, big questions. I also think I might pull out some old stuff. I actually ran for Congress a few times some years back, and I'm thinking about pulling out some of the proposals that I made at the time to see how well they've held up, and I'm sure you're eagerly looking forward to that. Anyway, that's it for this week. I'm going to get out of here. You have the best week you possibly can. We will see you next week. As always, peace.